The weather was cold, with a trace of snow and sleet. It was a dreary January evening in Washington, D.C. Yet a multitude of people gathered on the steps of the United States Capitol. They came for a chance to gain admittance to the rotunda and be a part of the history being created inside. This spontaneous outpouring in 1871 was like nothing the nation's capital had seen for years. Inside the rotunda, the Marine Band began to play. The assembled members of the Senate and House of Representatives, along with their families and friends, watched as the procession of dignitaries entered. Led by President Grant, the delegation included the Cabinet, the Supreme Court, and foreign ambassadors from many nations. When they had taken their seats, the doors were opened and the crowd surged in. The rotunda soon filled to capacity. The doors were closed and those who were left outside pounded on the great doors. What could command the attention of so many people, both famous and common? After a speech, Supreme Court Justice David Davis raised the red, white, and blue American flag made of silk, a gift from the people of France, to reveal what all had come to see: the marble statue of Abraham Lincoln. In a moment etched in time, applause broke out, filling the rotunda and washing over the statue and its creator, the young woman sculptor Vinnie Ream. Just 23 years old, Miss Ream hardly looked like a master craftsman. The saga began on a dreary evening in April of 1865, when a shot rang out at Ford's Theater in Washington. The next day, the country learned that Abraham Lincoln had died. One person destined to be affected by the news was Vinnie Ream, then a teenage girl and a young apprentice sculptor who was modeling the president. Miss Ream was in agony with grief and could not then envision the fateful opportunity the tragedy would present. Lincoln allowed the modeling sessions when he heard the young art prodigy was a poor Western girl, born in a log cabin in the wilds of Madison, Wisconsin. When Lincoln was asked about the request, the president drawled a quick reply.
Poor, is she? Well, that's nothing agin her.
As Vinnie Ream modeled Lincoln, she acquired his persona. She later recalled the experience that would come to change her life.
And so it was. The great heart which vanity could not unlock opened with the sympathy that recalled his own youth. I was modeling him in clay, but all the time his personality was sinking deeper into my soul.
She was an unlikely-looking sculptor, with her chestnut ringlets and elfin smile. Standing less than 5 feet tall, her diminutive stature was reported by one visiting journalist who observed that less than 5 feet intervened between the topmost curl and the faded carpet below. Vinnie Ream was compared to charismatic women of the past. One visiting writer noted, "She has the same large, lustrous black eyes that show a rich, grand nature." And like other women of influence, she seemed to know the power of subtle diplomacy. After meeting the diminutive charmer, one doting elderly congressman remarked, "What a wonderful way that girl has of squeezing one's hand." But it wasn't just coquetry, as some of her critics claimed. Studio visitors often saw Vinnie Ream looking radiant in a long white gown, with a white dove on her shoulder. Other journalists noted her charisma, writing that Miss Ream causes the visitor to at once feel at home. She is all vivacity, and you feel at once the power of her personal magnetism. Another correspondent observed that she was nervous, spirituelle, slightly built, simple and unaffected as a child, with a peculiarly changeful expression of countenance. Her personality is as wonderful as her talent. To help raise public awareness about the sculptor, the life and art of Vinnie Ream has been chronicled in a thorough, documented book written by Colorado author Glenn Sherwood.
Being related to the Ream family through both parents, I decided to write a comprehensive illustrated biography about Vinnie Ream when I discovered that nothing quite like it had ever been done before. That project became a 10-year odyssey. To me, it was a great learning experience, and done in the hope that it can help make this important artist better known.
When I saw Vinnie Ream's picture and read about her life and art, I knew I had to publish her story. Not only did she sculpt one of the most important statues in the history of our country, her life and talents are an inspiration to women and men alike. I saw it as a worthwhile, courageous story about a very special woman. I feel honored to have worked on this project.
Vinnie's story has always impressed me. Just imagining that someone only 18 years old could have gotten the commission to do one of the most important statues in the country at the time, the Lincoln. And I think she is a wonderful role model for young women today. I mean, any teenager can kind of relate to her.
And it was fairly recently that I heard of Vinnie, and I'm astonished that someone of her caliber with a story as interesting as hers has been overlooked for so long.
Vinnie Ream was born in Madison, Wisconsin on September 25, 1847, as Lavinia Ellen Ream, the youngest daughter of Robert and Lavinia Ream, who came to the Midwest from Pennsylvania. Her father was of German Pennsylvania Deutsch lineage. Her mother's family, the MacDonalds, were of Scottish ancestry. Vinnie Ream was born in a log cabin built in 1837 on a narrow isthmus between Lakes Monona and Mendota, near the present-day Wisconsin state capitol. The cabin was operated by the Reams as a stagecoach stop, and it served as one of the first hotels in the area. Guests slept on the floor at the rate of 2 pence per square foot. Vinnie Ream learned how to draw and paint from Winnebago Indians in Wisconsin. Later, in 1854, as a child of 7, she had played with clay often during her visits to the Washington, D.C. studio of sculptor Benjamin Paul Akers after her family had moved to the city. Her early attempts at clay modeling showed talent, and Akers predicted she would go far. Vinnie Ream and her family left Washington when her father accepted a surveying assignment in Kansas. But she was sent to a women's college in Columbia, Missouri, where she became an outstanding student in art, literature, and music. At age 12, her prose was printed by the press, and she began to write poetry. Her early art was notable, and she painted a portrait of Martha Washington for her literary society. When the Civil War began, the family was living in Fort Smith, Arkansas. With great difficulty, they made their way through the Southern lines and returned to Washington, where Vinnie Ream obtained a job with the Postal Service as a clerk in the Dead Letter Office, a position she held until after the war. Miss Ream served as a volunteer for war relief and wrote letters for wounded soldiers in the hospitals. She sang in benefit concerts and sang as a paid vocalist at local churches in Washington, D.C., such as the historic Church of the Epiphany. She played the piano, harp, and guitar with exquisite skill. She did not waste time in trivial pastimes. She told her mother of a feeling of destiny that provided a guiding force.
I feel that I am to have some special work in the world. I don't know what it is, but I must be ready for it when it comes.
In 1863, Miss Ream made a more eventful visit to a sculpture studio. Missouri Congressman James Rollins took her to an improvised studio at the United States Capitol to see the sculptor Clark Mills about having a sculpture made for the school at Columbia. Mills was in charge of casting the Statue of Freedom in bronze for the U.S. Capitol Dome. Upon watching Mills model the clay, the enthusiastic Vinnie blurted an audacious notion.
I can do that.
Mills tossed her a wad of clay that she began to shape and form. She soon succeeded in molding the clay into a convincing likeness of an old Indian chief. Mills was so impressed, he invited her to return as a student helper. Miss Ream made the most of working in the studio at the Capitol. She rapidly made portrait busts and relief medallions of many notables, including Congressman Daniel Voorhees, Secretary of State William Seward, and Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens. The beleaguered statesman often sought the secluded isolation of the Capitol studio to relax. Often having that strange insensibility that accompanies inordinate vanity, they knew no greater eulogy than to be immortalized in stone. Sculptors were special. Congressmen like John Wentworth popularized the novelty of the Wonder Girl artist. Miss Ream later recalled the support that many had given her.
As a plant thrives beneath the sunlight, so I throve under their generous influence. And I worked early and late so that they should not be disappointed in their little protege.
During the war, Miss Ream often went to the Capitol early in the morning to watch the sunrise. She could often hear the fire of cannon in the distance. In her study of art, Vinnie Ream went to a graveyard to study the monuments. She came upon the grave of a young girl who was about her own age and a whole family that had perished together. Death by disease or by warfare was a constant sobering reality in wartime Washington. Miss Ream seemed to take the fleeting nature of life philosophically, with no delusions of being invincible. She wrote down a poem of her impressions.
We are all but passing by, as on life's sunny vale we glide. Do we think that death is nigh, or think that life's a lasting tide?
Vinnie Ream's brother Bob left the family and served in the rebel army, which would later raise allegations that the artist was a Confederate sympathizer, and this may have influenced her art. Vinnie Ream began her career during the Civil War. One of her earliest works was The Dying Standard Bearer, a medallion which depicted a color bearer dying in battle. It was the Lincoln administration's goal to keep the Union intact and seek its quick restoration after the war. In the spirit of this idea, Miss Ream created a national emblematical fountain group of 4 figures. It was called The Union Restored, as it is to be. The work consisted of 4 sisters gathered around the American flag, with figures representing the North, the South, the East, and the West regions of the Union. One of these figures, the West, was rendered in marble, and today stands in the Wisconsin State Capitol. The figure depicted the young West in the act of walking or pressing forward.
Another early full-length figure was the gladiator Spartacus that Miss Ream modeled after a self-study of anatomy, which, like medicine, was considered a taboo subject for respectable young ladies to study. Vinnie Ream also made a bust of her sister's child, titled The Morning Glory, after the garland which adorned the lower perimeter of the figure, a method also employed by other sculptors to conceal the cut-off effect of the arms. Miss Ream made a series of portraits of young women done in the same manner. One of the earliest of these was titled The Violet, which some thought to be a self-portrait. The Butterfly and a companion bust titled The Lily were portraits of the laughing twin children of Capitol architect Edward Clark. The butterfly shown on the child's shoulder was a symbol of immortal life. In February of 1865, Clark Mills made a lithe mask of Lincoln, which revealed a startling change in the president's appearance from one made by Leonard Wells Volk. Abraham Lincoln had aged with great rapidity. Vinnie Ream developed several versions of Lincoln busts and relief medallions that were praised by colleagues of the martyred president for their remarkable fidelity. Her skill with portraiture grew to a higher level. After Lincoln's death, Vinnie learned that interest was growing for a statue for the U.S. Capitol. She sent a letter to the committee asking for the job and submitted a copy of the Lincoln bust as an example of her work. She expressed some doubt that her work would even be considered.
I thought they would laugh at me.
But they didn't laugh. The cagey Republican patriarch Thaddeus Stevens championed the idea and orchestrated a resolution to give Vinnie Ream the coveted commission outright. The measure drew fire from East Coast art advocates and resulted in a lengthy debate when the bill came to the Senate on a hot July evening in 1866. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts led the opposition.
This candidate is not competent to produce the work which you propose to order. She cannot do it. Admit that she may make a statue. She cannot make one that you will be justified in placing in the national Capitol.
Sumner argued that a sculptor should be sought with ripe genius and ample knowledge of art, and said that Congress should recruit a more experienced and conventional American sculptor, such as the aging Hiram Powers. But the rugged Senator James Nesmith of Oregon clashed with the vociferous Sumner, whom he saw as a mouthpiece for educated East Coast ideas.
The senator might have raised the same objection to Mr. Lincoln, that he was not qualified for the presidency because his reading had not been as extensive as that of the senator, or because he had lived among rude and uncultivated society.
Senator Richard Yates of Illinois and Senator McDougal of California had been friends of Lincoln and praised Vinnie Ream's model. But Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan, who was also educated in the East, chided them and echoed Sumner's views.
We have not an artist of competency among ourselves, and I expect, having in view the youth and inexperience of Miss Ream, and I will go further and say, having in view her sex, that I shall expect a complete failure in this work.
Howard's sexist remarks hurt the opposition. Vinnie Ream had her own backers, who had garnered a petition in support of her ability. Remarkably, the document bore the signatures of President Andrew Johnson, the Attorney General, the Speaker of the House, the General of the Army, a large group of senators and representatives in Congress, and an impressive list of noted politicians, generals, diplomats, and artists. Congress had acquired a posture of ultra-Americanism to foster development of native art talent. Some senators were still nervous about art fiascos of the Capitol, like Greenough's massive half-nude statue of George Washington, which had bore the brunt of ridicule. Sumner gave a half-baked tirade about U.S. Capitol art that pointed out the good works, but he also defended Greenough's work as one that demonstrated a high knowledge of art. Senator Edgar Cohen of Pennsylvania seemed to sum up the prevailing sentiments.
If the statuary in the Capitol is in bad taste, let us improve it. And I do not know any other way than to employ this young lady who manifests such extraordinary ability.
Other senators challenged Howard, and his replies deteriorated into a bombastic harangue that belittled the abilities of women in general, which helped swing the vote in Vinnie Ream's favor. Both Howard and the staunch abolitionist Charles Sumner had missed the point of the debate entirely. The commission reflected post-war views about a new birth of freedom that broke down many barriers. The artist was likened to the rough-hewn president she was destined to model, a man of humble origin, who was largely self-taught and who cared little about Eastern conventionalities. The award represented a culture clash between settled Eastern ideas and the fresh, independent spirit of the West. Vinnie Ream became a living symbol who stood for a distinctive form of art that represented common Americans rather than cultivated aristocrats.
When the final vote was taken, the commission was awarded to Vinnie Ream with 23 ayes, 9 nays, and 18 absent. So Miss Ream, at the age of 18, became the first woman and the youngest artist to ever receive a U.S. government commission for a statue. She had the award, but the seemingly generous Congress gave her no advance money to fund the work, as was often done with such commissions. The contract required her to build a life-size plaster model acceptable to the Secretary of the Interior prior to receipt of a half payment of $5,000. Vinnie Ream was allowed to use a room in the Capitol to model the work and had the undraped figure inspected by surgeons for accuracy. She borrowed the Brooks Brothers suit that Lincoln actually wore on the night of the assassination to help achieve authenticity. With reverence and trembling hands, she measured the blood-stained garments.
Meanwhile, the act of Congress giving a major art commission to a teenage girl from the West created a rhubarb of regional rivalry. Vinnie Ream became famous overnight. A Milwaukee paper printed much of the Senate debate under the headline, "Congress Captured by a Wisconsin Girl." Some papers responded by upbraiding Miss Ream and her congressional patrons. Many Eastern art connoisseurs were offended and thought anything outside their sphere of influence to be inferior. Miss Ream's beauty was both a blessing and a curse, attracting many smitten swains. The unruly woman correspondent Jane Swisshelm blasted Vinnie Ream in a column that suggested she had used feminine wiles to cajole the commission. The story was widely printed. One perceptive editor titled the piece, "A Homely Woman's Opinion of a Pretty One." During the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson, a brouhaha erupted again when Vinnie Ream was targeted by Reconstruction radicals to influence the vote of Senator Edmund Ross, who was a boarder in the Ream home. It was alleged that radicals visited Miss Ream and suggested that if she did not influence Ross to vote for Johnson's conviction, it would be the worst for her. Vinnie Ream's refusal to be involved in the frenzy to dump Johnson led a group of impeachment managers to evict her from the Capitol studio. The room was commandeered as a jail under the guise that it was needed to imprison a Cincinnati lawyer for questioning, who had earned a tidy sum of money betting on the outcome of the trial. The radicals, enraged by the failed impeachment, even implied that a special cell would be fitted up for the uncooperative Miss Ream. Some of her supporters, like the distinguished lawyer and Senator Reverdy Johnson, offered to defend her in the fracas. One radical leader was especially abrasive. The former Civil War General Benjamin Franklin Butler was called the Beast for his severe steamroller tactics. From the floor of the House, the bombastic Butler bellowed, "It is very clear that these rooms should be cleaned out, and at once. Let her and everyone else who visits her there be cleared out. And if the statue of Mr. Lincoln, which he is supposed to be making, is spoilt, in so doing as one of his friends, I shall be very glad of it. For, from what I hear of it, I think it is a thing that will do neither him nor the country credit." Here the gavel fell. "War on women," the Democratic press announced, and several articles titled "Beauty and the Beast" appeared blasting Butler and his gang. Vinnie Ream denied involvement, and her studio would later be reinstated by the influence of Thaddeus Stevens. Justice and mercy. Congress has once again disposed of the weighty case of Miss Vinnie Ream, wrote the New York Times. But the subtle Miss Ream was sympathetic. She would often be credited with preventing Andrew Johnson's premature ouster from the presidency. The studio became a fashionable attraction. Many venerable visitors came, like the Civil War photographer Matthew Brady, the poet Walt Whitman, writer Lew Wallace, and political cartoonist Thomas Nast. The studio was near the office of Supreme Court Justice David Davis, who had been Lincoln's personal manager. He visited often, giving advice. Vinnie Ream later recalled their support.
Friends flocked around Judge Davis. He was the lodestar who drew them to my studio. Friend and foe gathered there with a common interest, the success of the work. Old feuds were forgotten, and they met on neutral ground, some on friendly terms who had not spoken to each other for years.
After the Lincoln model was completed and approved, Miss Ream and her parents sailed for Europe, where the statue would be rendered in marble. She planned to select the stone and supervise the rough cutting in Italy before finishing the statue with her own hands. After arriving in England, they toured the British Museum and traveled on to France. The family stayed 3 months in Paris while Miss Ream studied with Gustave Doré and other local artists. In October, the family left for Austria, Switzerland, and Munich in Germany, where she visited the art school of Wilhelm Kaulbach. They went on to Italy, stopping in Florence and Venice. Shortly after arriving in Rome, the young woman sculptor and her parents took apartments in an old palace. Miss Ream secured a studio where the Lincoln model was put on display. Almost from the moment of her arrival, Vinnie Ream was deluged with visitors. In Rome, she modeled a bust of composer Franz Liszt. She had a letter of introduction to Cardinal Antonelli and modeled a bust of the redoubtable secretary to the pontiff. Antonelli was very impressed that the government would trust her with such an important work as the Lincoln statue, and he gave her a valuable cameo locket that was carved at the Vatican. American artists living in Rome became friends and advised her about refinements to the Lincoln model. Many American sculptors came to offer advice and encouragement. William Wetmore Story visited, and others were notable woman sculptor Harriet Hosmer and the black American sculptress Edmonia Lewis.
Another mentor was the American portrait painter George P.A. Healy. George Healy painted a portrait of Miss Ream in Rome, which was donated to the Smithsonian in 1917. One writer seeing the work noted, "The likeness is almost startling. The dark eyes are full of a soft melancholy fire, and the curves of the crimson lips are expressive of the woman's sensitiveness rather than the artist's triumph. It is a thoughtful, earnest face. In looking at it, one cannot but feel that the crown of genius may be lined with thorns."
In late 1870, Vinnie Ream returned with her marble statue of Lincoln which was soon unveiled at the Capitol in a dazzling ceremony attended by the highest officials of the government. Orators alluded to its spiritual significance and its purity of marble as a symbol of divine providence. Soon afterward, the $5,000 due the artist was doubled by Congress in view of her success. The increased amount fueled another uproar in the press. A prominent Chicago paper ran a spicy article about busts on exhibition. Jaundiced lady writers in Horace Greeley's New York Daily Tribune blasted Miss Ream's work as a frightful abortion. They called the artist a fraud who had hired patient drudges to carve the statue while the lady flitted and flirted about Rome. An editorial in the Tribune went on to blast the supportive congressmen as men of deficient moral sense. A February 1871 news story in another paper reported that Vinnie Ream had received a letter from a man connected with the Tribune offering her $1,000 to relinquish the commission to a sculptor favored by the Tribune. The writers asked, "Does this account for the Tribune's malignity?" The redoubtable Hiram Powers wrote a letter from Florence implying that Miss Ream was a mountebank with no more talent for art than a carver of weeping willows on a tombstone. It was also reported that the aging sculptor had said that Vinnie Ream's success was evidence of the prostitution of art at our capital. Articles appeared blasting Powers, and the New York World later printed a letter that suggested art fraud allegations were being perpetuated by a clique who, under the mantle of Hiram Powers, proposed to perpetuate for their own benefit the monopoly of American patronage, which he enjoyed, to discourage any aspirations which American youth may indulge in competition with them, and to break down any who may have the audacity to do so. A neoclassical critic named Curtis called the Lincoln figure an ugly statue of a limp, ill-favored man, and heckled, "What a gaunt, shameful specter of shapeless ugliness hath she hewn out of the unoffending marble."